A Week in the Woods, Day 3. The kids in front pushed their chairs back a little farther. Mr. Maxwell put the acid bottle down on the tabletop. Reaching below again, he pulled out a flask, lifted it up to eye level, and shook it. Little gray chunks rattled around inside the flask, making a sound like gravel inside in a soda bottle. Pointing at the flask, Mr. Maxwell said, "This flask contains small pieces of a metal with an odd name, zinc. That's Z-I-N-C. It's one of the elements from the periodic table. That means it's a pure substance, not mixed with anything else at all. It's a soft metal, and you've probably seen it before without knowing it. If you've ever seen a metal trash barrel, most of them are made from steel that's covered with a thin coat of zinc. The zinc keeps the steel from rusting. Now, watch what happens when I pour hydrochloric acid into the flask." He lifted the stopper out of the acid bottle and then slowly poured enough acid into the flask to cover the gray bits of zinc. After about 10 seconds, Mr. Maxwell asked, "Can anyone see what's happening?" In the front row, Jenny Rogers raised her hand, and when Mr. Maxwell nodded at her, she pointed at the flask and said, "Bubbles." "Exactly," boomed Mr. Maxwell. "Bubbles." He stoppered the acid bottle, put it away, and then reached into the pocket of his lab coat and pulled out a silver-colored balloon. The end of the balloon had been pulled around a black rubber stopper, with one hole through it. Quickly, Mr. Maxwell pushed the rubber stopper into the opening of the flask and then stepped back so he could observe the flask and the class at the same time. Mark Chelmsley was still looking out the window. As the rest of the class watched in silence, the silver balloon began to get bigger. In 15 seconds, it was the size of a grapefruit, and in 30 seconds, it was as big as a soccer ball. Then Mr. Maxwell pinched the neck of the balloon shut with his thumb and index finger and pulled the stopper out of the flask. Still pinching the balloon tightly, he pulled the rubber stopper out of the end and then tied the balloon shut. Reaching again into the pocket of his lab coat, he pulled out a long piece of string. One end of the string had a loop tied in it, and the other end was tied to a half-kilogram weight. Slipping the loop over the end of the balloon, he pulled the slip knot tight and then let go. Instantly, the balloon rose into the air, pulling the string into a straight white line. Mr. Maxwell placed the weight on the tabletop and stepped to one side. Now, back to the Hindenburg. The airship weighed many, many tons, but it had no rocket engines or airplane wings to keep it up in the air. How did it stay aloft? Look at this balloon and think. When you think you know, raise your hand. By the time 5 seconds had passed, every kid had a hand in the air, except for one. Mark was slumped in his chair, elbow on his desk, chin propped on one palm, staring at the floor. It was time to try the direct approach. Mr. Maxwell looked past all those waving hands and said, "Mark, any idea how the Hindenburg stayed aloft?" Mark tilted his chin up until his eyes met Mr. Maxwell's. Then he shrugged and looked away. Mr. Maxwell smiled and said, "You must at least have an idea, Mark." Nothing. Mark kept his face toward the window. Mr. Maxwell didn't let up. "Come on, Mark, make a guess." Mark turned and put both his hands on his desk. Looking straight right at Mr. Maxwell, he said, "Okay, sure. Here's my guess. The airship stayed up because it was filled with a gas that was lighter than air. It was filled with hydrogen, same as that balloon. And you made the gas because there was a reaction between the acid and the zinc, and the bubbles were hydrogen gas. And your balloon is probably going to burn up with a big noise, because I bet that's what happened to the Hindenburg. I bet the hydrogen inside it blew up, and a bunch of the passengers got killed." For a second or two, Mr. Maxwell didn't know how to react. Mark had just spoiled the best part of the demonstration. Thoughts swirled through his mind, and Mr. Maxwell felt his anger stir. It was so clear Mark had done it on purpose. He had given away all the secrets and ruined the big finish of the Friday show. Still, Mark had been pushed pretty hard. By me, thought Mr. Maxwell. And on the good side, it was the first time the boy had said something in class. Plus, what he'd said had been exactly right about everything. So that's what Mr. Maxwell focused on, the good side. He decided to try to keep Mark talking. Mr. Maxwell nodded appreciatively. "So you know about the Hindenburg. Where did you learn about it?" Mark shrugged. "School, history class, I guess. Hitler and everything." "And do you remember how it started to burn, Mark?" Mark shrugged and shook his head. "Was it lightning or maybe a careless smoker? Because you're right, hydrogen gas is very light, but it is also very flammable. Remember how it happened, Mark?" Another shrug and a head shake. Mark was done talking. The other kids were getting restless, so Mr. Maxwell moved on. He got out a meter stick. and taped a wooden match to one end. He talked about the Hindenburg trying to land at the metal mooring tower. Then he punched the play button on a cassette boombox, and the room was filled with the sound of the classic radio broadcast of the Hindenburg disaster, with the announcer wailing, "Oh, the humanity, the humanity," as he watched burning people fall to the ground. Mr. Maxwell lit the match and said, "To this day, no one knows what created the spark, but one thing is for certain, there was a spark." And then he touched the burning match on the stick to the balloon, and boom! It exploded in a flash of flame. The kids paid attention pretty well, and they all liked the final burst of fire, but it didn't work like it usually did. It fell flat because everyone had already known what was going to happen, thanks to Mark. And did Mark watch the big finish? Mr. Maxwell looked his way as the balloon went up in flames. At that moment, Mark was looking out the window. The show was over. Mr. Maxwell took off his white lab coat and laid it across the table. He stepped around behind his desk and yanked at the bottom of the out-of-date periodic table chart that covered part of the chalkboard, guiding it upward on its roller. The chart had been covering the homework assignment. Patting the chalkboard, Mr. Maxwell said, "Over the weekend, I want everyone to reread Chapter 17 so we can discuss it on Monday. Then on Tuesday, we'll have a quiz on photosynthesis and how plant life affects different ecosystems. You can all read until the bell rings." Most of the kids got out their books and began reading. Not Mark. He turned sideways in his chair so he could keep an eye on the clock. He didn't want to be surprised again by that awful bell. Chapter 7, Skirmish. With 4 minutes to go before the last bell of the day, the kids in the room 7 were pretending to read their science books, and Mr. Maxwell was pretending to clean up the lab station. The kids were actually fidgeting and whispering and counting down the seconds to the weekend, and Mr. Maxwell was actually processing new information about Mark Chelmsley. He reasoned his way through the results of his experiment. What had he just learned by putting some pressure on the boy? Well, for one thing, that slacker attitude had to be an act. This kid was plenty bright, maybe too bright for his own good. Maybe he should have been put into the gifted program, probably ahead of most of the town kids, and not just in science class either. Probably bored as well as spoiled. And the kid had spirit too. Got pushed in the corner, and what did he do? He pushed back, that's what. Spilled the beans about the hydrogen in the Hindenburg. Maybe a bit of mean streak there somewhere too. Seemed to enjoy spoiling show, being the know-it-all. Mean? Maybe. But maybe something else too. As he put the acid on a shelf in the locked storage cabinet, Mr. Maxwell remembered there was something he needed to tell Mark. He had some good news for Mark, and he was glad because he wanted to keep after this boy, keep trying to reach him. He had recently added a new item to the bottom of his Week in the Woods checklist. Give registration packet to Mark Chelmsley. The other 5th graders had gotten theirs back in January. He had put a complete packet in his desk drawer 2 days ago, all stapled and ready with Mark's name on it. Mr. Maxwell had been waiting for the right moment to take Mark aside and tell him a little about the program, maybe get him excited about it and give him the information sheets. And then, in 10 seconds before the bell rang, Mr. Maxwell decided that the right moment had arrived. A few quick strides took him to the back of the room. "Mark?" The boy jerked his head around and flinched as Mr. Maxwell said his name. Then the bell sounded, and Mr. Maxwell saw Mark flinch again. Speaking loudly enough to be heard above the sudden burst of noise in the room, he said, "Mark, stay after a second, will you? I've got something you need to take home for this weekend." For a second, Mark looked like he was going to bolt out of his seat and dash for the door. Then he relaxed a little, stood up slowly, and grabbed his backpack. "Just come up to my desk," Mr. Maxwell said, leading the way. "This will only take a minute or two." Mark walked to the front of the room and stopped about 2 feet to the left of Mr. Maxwell's desk. The teacher rustled through some papers and then looked over at him with a smile. "Have you heard the kids talking about a week in the woods?" Mark looked at him blankly. "Haven't heard a thing about it." Mark's face remained expressionless, and he shook his head. "Well, it's a week when the whole 5th grade goes to a state park campground together. And it's like a campout, except we spend some time each day doing science and ecology observations and some other assignments and experiments too. But mostly, it's a lot of fun. Here." And Mr. Maxwell held out a set of stapled pages. Mark took them and glanced down. The cover had some student artwork of cabins and trees and mountains surrounding the title of the program. "We've been doing this here in Whitson for a lot of years now, and all the kids have a great time, and so do the teachers. Parents, too. We always need all the helpers and chaperones we can get. If your folks wanted to help out, they'd be welcome." When he said that, Mr. Maxwell thought he saw a flash in the boy's eyes. Mark said, "Anything else?" "No, that's it, really. The packet has a lot of good information. A permission form you need to get signed and bring back, all the dates, things you need to bring with you, things not to bring. As he kept talking, Mark began flipping through the pages. The school provides all the meals. There are boys' and girls' bunkhouses, and the restrooms and the shower facilities are almost as nice as home. It's really a great experience. Any questions you want to ask about any of it? I've been at this a few years, so Mark looked up from the packet and said, Does everyone have to go? Have to go? Mr. Maxwell was stunned. Well, everyone always does. It's really a lot of fun. I'm sure you're going to have a great time, Mark. So everyone has to go? Mark asked again. Mr. Maxwell stood up quickly, and his chair banged back against the chalk rail. I guess I haven't explained it well enough, Mark. This is the best week of the whole school year. Every kid who wasn't sicker than a dog has always been dying to go. Mr. Maxwell was leaning forward, and he felt like he was talking too loud and too fast, but he couldn't help it. Don't you see? It's like a whole week of playing hooky, so why wouldn't a kid want to go? But if you're going to put it that way, there are assignments every day, and there are grades for those assignments. And if you want to think of it that way, then yes, every fifth grade student has to go. There was silence for a second, and then Mark said, Unless he gets sick. Mr. Maxwell clenched his jaw and glared down at Mark. Right, unless he gets sick. Mark wasn't flinching now. He looked Mr. Maxwell in the eye and asked, Anything else that you need to give me? With all his heart, Mr. Maxwell wanted to give this smart-faced kid a serious piece of his mind, but he managed to take a deep breath and say, No, that's it. If you or your parents have any questions, let me know. Have a good weekend. And he turned abruptly, grabbed an eraser, and began sweeping it across the chalkboard with sharp, jerky strokes. He heard Mark's footsteps out in the hall, but Mr. Maxwell didn't turn around. He kept on erasing. He heard the fire door clang shut. By then, the chalkboard was completely clean, but Mr. Maxwell didn't stop erasing until he'd gone over the whole thing 2 more times. When Mark came out the front door of the school, the buses were just pulling away. He walked over to where Leon was parked, yanked the passenger door open, dropped his book bag onto the floorboard, climbed in, pulled the heavy door shut, and fastened his seatbelt. Leon nodded and smiled, but didn't offer a greeting. He had learned that right after school was not a good time to chat. The door locks clicked as he put the car into gear and drove out of the school driveway. Mark took a deep breath and settled back into the seat. Music from a dozen speakers filled the space around him. Jazz. Leon always listened to jazz after school. Mark looked past the wipers at the falling snow. He sat forward so he could see better. There was no wind, and the snow was forming little piles on the limbs of the trees and on the telephone wires beside the road. And as he began to think about the snow building up on the hills around his house and on the roof of the barn, the school week began to melt away. Halfway home, Mark thought, Saturday and Sunday, 2 whole days. And he smiled to himself, his first real smile of the day. They drove 5 miles past the west edge of town. When Leon turned into the long drive, Mark was caught off guard again by the beauty of the place. It wasn't the weathered house, or the dull red barn, or the dark rock walls that framed the frozen pond farther down the hillside. It wasn't the stand of pine trees along the ridge to the west, or the top of Mount Washington far to the northeast, hidden now by snow clouds, but still there. It wasn't any one thing. It was everything altogether that dazzled him. As Leon stopped the car to wait for the electric opener to lift the door, Mark jumped out, grabbed his backpack, scooted around behind the car, and dashed for the mudroom. Thanks for the ride, Leon. Leon smiled and waved, then eased the heavy car forward into the garage. He chuckled to himself, nodding. He knew the change in Mark's spirits weren't just because it was Friday afternoon. Leon had seen it happen day after day. He looked forward to it now, like a daily miracle. Every afternoon, it was as if a bitter old man came limping out of the school and crawled into the car. It was only a 15-minute drive, but by the time they reached home, that angry little man became a completely different person. Mark turned into a boy again. Chapter 8. Discoveries. Mark had already been to his room to change into his warm pants and socks. Anya caught him rushing through the kitchen, zipping up his coat. Hands on her hips, she blocked his way. No, you don't. Anya, I don't have time. And I'm really not hungry. She pointed at the kitchen table. Sit and eat. You are a growing boy, and outside is very cold. It was the same every afternoon. She always made him eat before he went out. So Mark sat down, popped a cookie into his mouth, and took a gulp of chocolate milk. Anya turned and walked into the laundry room. Before she could come back to inspect, Mark drained the glass and stuffed the other cookies and the apple slices into his coat pocket. He tiptoed to the mudroom, pulled on his boots, grabbed his hat and gloves, and slipped out the door. He had important business in the barn. From his very first morning at the new house, Mark had been itching to get outdoors and explore, but he'd had to wait. That first Saturday 2 weeks ago, his parents had arrived about noon. His mom had planned a family weekend. Family weekend was one of his mom's code phrases, and Mark knew what it meant. It meant that on Sunday night or early Monday morning, his parents would be leaving again. They would spend some quality time together over the weekend, and since Mark was sure his parents' idea of quality time didn't include tramping around out in the cold, the outdoors would have to wait until the family weekend was over. Mark and his mom and dad had taken a drive together late Saturday afternoon. They drove through Whitson and stopped to take a look at the school Mark would be attending. His dad had said, "Looks pretty small, don't you think?" But his mom quickly said, "I've talked with Mrs. Gibson, the principal, and it's a fine little school. It'll be a good experience, and besides, Mark's only going to be here a few months." There wasn't a lot to see in Whitson, so they'd headed 16 miles east to Eltonboro. It was larger, but there wasn't that much to see there either. They drove around the old center of town, and his mom commented on the quaintness of the homes. They drove past the new mall on the outskirts of town, and his dad commented on how slow business must be during the winter. Then they drove back to the new house. Saturday night, Anya had cooked steaks on the indoor grill, and Mark and his parents ate dinner in the old dining room. Later, Mark sat between his mom and dad in their new home theater. They watched a movie and ate popcorn and milk duds and drank some strawberry soda. When the movie was over, his dad yawned and said, "I've got to turn in, guys. That flight from San Francisco was a beast. You coming to bed now, Lo?" His mom nodded, and it was her turn to yawn. "It's been a long day, but a good one." "It's so quiet here. I love that, don't you, Mark?" Mark said, "I don't know yet, but I can deal with it." "That's what I like to hear," his dad said. "I've been telling your mom to stop worrying about you. When things change, you just have to tough it out. And believe me, everything keeps changing. All your life. That's the one thing you can count on." He yawned again as he stood up. "See you tomorrow, kiddo." And he gave Mark a pat on the back as he left the room. When they were all alone, his mom said, "Mark, we're going to have to leave tomorrow afternoon. Will you be okay? I know it's a lot to get used to all at once, and I'm sorry we can't be here for your first day at the new school. We have to be in New York, and that's that." Mark said, "It's okay, really. I'm glad you came home." And Mark had meant it. He was glad they cared enough to take a cross-country plane trip just to spend a little time with him. Mark knew lots of kids at Lawton Country Day School whose parents wouldn't have bothered. While his dad slept in on Sunday morning, Mark and his mom feasted on fresh-baked Russian pastries, one of Anya's specialties. After breakfast, Mark said, "You know about the room where they say the runaway slaves hid, right? I found it. Come on." Together they wound their way up the narrow steps, Mark in the lead. The room was tiny, just big enough for a rope-frame bed and a small washstand. The walls were made of rough pine boards, and the only light came filtering up from the cupboard door below. Mark's mom had to duck to keep from bumping into the low-beamed ceiling. Mark ran his hand along the rail of the bed. He whispered, "Makes you think, doesn't it?" His mom nodded, and they tiptoed back down the stairs. Sunday afternoon, Mark had gone along for the ride when Leon drove his parents to the regional airport. At the gate, his mom said, "We'll try to be back for next weekend, sweetheart. We love you very much, and you have a good first week at your new school, all right?" Mark smiled and nodded. "Sure thing. That's my boy." His dad tousled his hair. "See you soon, Mark." And that was the end of the first family weekend at the new house. Monday afternoon, Mark got home from his first day at the new school and finally got to set off into the great outdoors. After bundling up under Anya's watchful eye, he had gone out the back door of the garage and headed toward the woods that covered the steep slope to the south and east of the house. When he'd returned huffing and puffing 15 minutes later, he was soaked up to his waist, with snow jammed up under his jacket, his face bright red. Leon was waiting for him in the garage. He pointed at a short stool. "Shake off the snow, then sit and catch your breath. Just sit. Now you know that no one can plow through the deep snow, so I will teach you to go on top of it." Leon slipped the toes of his boots into a pair of long snowshoes made of bent wood and rawhide strips. He buckled the straps on the bindings, stood up, and said, "First, you watch." Leon shuffled out the front of the garage. He took a few quick strides beyond the snowbanks to the left of the driveway until he was walking where the snow was deep and unpacked. "See? A heavy man, but he only sinks a few inches." He stopped to make sure Mark was watching. Mark was on his feet, all eyes. Moving again, Leon said, "Forward, always forward. Keep your legs apart to keep the shoes from banging. And keep the tips up and the tails dragging. Just so." Leon came back into the garage. "Now your turn." Bending down, he laced Mark into the bindings of a smaller pair of snowshoes. "These are Anya's. I think too big for you. Still, you can learn." And Mark did. After losing his balance once and after letting the toes dig in and trip him a couple of times, Mark had gotten the feel of staying centered on the webbed platforms. With Leon behind him, Mark went back past the tracks he left as he had floundered through the 4 and 5 foot snowdrifts on the east side of the house. "Look," he shouted, "it's like I'm floating." When his mom called that night to ask how his first day of school had been, Mark said, "Fine, but you know what? I learned how to snowshoe today. Leon taught me. Anya's snowshoes are a little too big, but Leon said I did great." His mom said, "That's wonderful, dear. And school was all right? Were the teachers nice? And the children?" "School was fine, Mom. So, can I get my own snowshoes?" "Of course, sweetheart. If you can't find what you want in Whitson or Altenborough, you can shop online. I'll tell Anya it's all right when I speak with her. Get all the gear you need, dear."